Welcome in, everyone, to a new edition of Just Another College Football Podcast, what I am calling the grand reopening of Just Another College Football Podcast. I'm your host, Tommy Brzee. If you have not come across this podcast, first of all, thank you very much for tuning in. It means the world to me. We have now set up the YouTube page, so please subscribe over there, like over there, then go over to Spotify, do the exact same thing, then on over to Apple Podcasts and do the exact same thing, because this is something that I've wanted to do for a long time. I did get into it during the 2023 season, stepped away last February, about a year ago today, really about a year ago, and started at GSMC, which was an incredible experience for me. Golden State Media Concepts gave me a great chance to talk about college football every day. If you're coming over from that page, glad to have you here. Obviously, awesome to have people watching along. Obviously, was an incredible thing. Did a daily show Monday through Friday over there, but now kind of found my way back to this passion project of mine, something that I've wanted to do for a very long time, hoping to build this out over the next couple of months, next couple of years, and really create this into something special. But I'm Tommy Brzee. Just a brief kind of story about me. I grew up in the Atlanta area. If you're new to this show, grew up in the Atlanta area, big time Atlanta sports fan. Grew up actually a Georgia Tech fan during kind of the Paul Johnson era, triple option era of college football. So absolutely love those teams. Joshua Nesbitt, Justin Thomas. Those are some of my favorite players growing up. Also grew up a Texas fan. So both my parents went to UT Austin. Huge Texas fan. Obviously a massive Longhorn fan because you kind of got to be. If both your parents went to Texas, you were going to be a big-time Texas fan one way or the other. And then finally went to college at Georgia. So am a Georgia Bulldog by heart. Was a very complicated season in 2024, having both those fandoms kind of battling against each other. And mainly, I kind of just wanted to go through all of that to start this show because I think it's an important thing to talk about. I think of way too many people in this business, both in sports and in college football more specifically, try to hide a lot of their biases, try to hide kind of their fandoms and different things, and I don't really see the utility in that. I don't see the point in that. I don't think any of us benefit from you not really knowing where I'm coming from, you not really knowing my story and my past, and really kind of my fandoms going into this thing. Now, I try my best to be impartial. I promise that. I try my best to give it to everyone the same exact way and not necessarily be biased towards one team, but all of us have our biases, and hiding them just doesn't really do anyone any good. So wanted to make sure I got that out of the way. Really, really happy for everyone that is watching along. Cannot thank you guys enough, and continue to watch along. This will likely be once a week during the off season. Probably kicking it a little into high gear during the season, maybe 2 a week, maybe 3 a week. Still kind of deciding on that. But I'm also putting out blogs and putting out a number of different things on my own website. So if you want to go follow over there, let me pull this up real quick. Over on X, if you want to follow me, it's Brzee_Thomas. If you want to go over to Instagram, got two for the for the Just Another College Football Podcast. GACFB Podcast is one, as well as Brzee.Thomas. We'll be posting there, both of those pretty regularly throughout this offseason and into the season, obviously. And then my blog, Thomas Brzee, BRESEE.squarespace.com, posting a ton of blogs, especially around the combine that's coming up, and is actually something we'll get into here in a second. And overall, just wanted to, talk about college football. That's kind of where I'm coming from here. I'm a fan like all of you guys. I'm not going to act like I am some great expert. I did not play the sport at a very high level, did not play in college, did not really play in high school. So I'm not going to try to talk down to anyone or anything like that. This is a podcast made by a fan for fans. So would love for you guys to follow along any type of college football fan you are. If you're just getting into it, great. Love to have you here. If you're just, if you're not too into it yet, but you're trying to get into it, please come along. If you're a huge diehard fan, you're right here with me. So absolutely, you're more than welcome to follow on. And overall, really just kind of want this to be comfortable. Not going to be a scripted podcast. Now, I do have some notes. I'm not just going to come on here and ramble every week, but there will be a kind of a good nature to this, a kind of ad-lib nature to this, so it feels a little bit more accessible. I don't necessarily love all the scripted stuff that goes out every now and then, so decided to kind of go away from that a little bit. Going to be a relatively unscripted podcast, and we'll kind of work from there. Would love to get the fans involved at some point. If you guys have any questions or things you want me to cover, please drop them in the comments or drop them pretty much anywhere. Tweet at me on Twitter, any of those places. I'm more than happy to answer, and we'll definitely get to that throughout this next little bit. But that's about enough about me. We are back on this Just Another College Football podcast. That's enough about the backstory of myself, the backstory of this podcast, and where I've been for the past year. But now I'm back, and let's go ahead and jump into this. And we got a big thing happening in the world of college football right about now, and it has to do with two of the biggest conferences in college football, the Big Ten and the SEC, and the CFP mainly. There's a big time things happening around the CFP in terms of what's going to happen in 2026. What is going to be the next kind of iteration of the playoff? We had the 12 team this year, and it went off really relatively well. You know, there were some downsides. Obviously, the seeding made a lot of people very angry, and that was a huge topic of conversation. And there were some kinks. There's no doubt about that, and they're trying to work those out. And there's a couple of different conversations about changing the seeding going into 2025, changing the seeding so it's not just the top four conference champions. It's just the top four teams in the country, which I think a lot of people are behind. The problem is, at least for this year, they have to get the sign off from the ACC, the Big 12, and all the other conferences for anything to happen in the CFP. The issue with that is, after the 2025 season, that's no longer the case. In the 2026 season and really going forward, the SEC and the Big Ten essentially have all of the negotiating power. They essentially get to decide which way this thing goes going forward, how this is going to work out, and let's be totally honest, the TV companies, all of those people will follow suit because that's where all the money comes from. I think we all understand that at this point, so it is not something that I don't think anything is going to happen to the CFP going into 2025. I think we will have a very similar format. I think the top four conference champions will get those automatic buys. I don't love that. I'll be totally honest. That's not the way that I would go about this. But frankly, I probably wouldn't expand it to 12 teams. So what do I know about this whole process? But at the end of the day, I do think it's a very interesting topic. I don't think 2025 is going to hold a lot of craziness. I do think beyond that is going to be a really interesting topic of conversation. And that's exactly what the SEC and the Big Ten met about last week, I believe on the 19th. They got together and started discussing the future of this sport, and they got a little bit deeper than 2026. They got all the way to 2032 or 2031, in some cases. But at the end of the day, let's talk about the stuff that's going to happen here relatively soon, and then we can get into the nightmare scenario that could be on the horizon here in a minute. But at the end of the day, for 2026, one of the big time things that has kind of gained traction is expanding the playoff. I imagine that. Obviously, people want to expand the playoff. Obviously, ESPN is very much pushing to have more of these games, to add to their inventory, to add to their paybook at the end of the day. So definitely going to be an interesting thing to watch. 14 teams seems to be kind of the way that this thing is going to bear out, and as we just talked about, it's probably going to change in 2026, which means these two guys have a ton of power. Greg Sankey, the commissioner of the SEC, Tony Petitti, the commissioner of the Big Ten. Both these guys are going to be huge to watch, and they're going to be two guys that have essentially all of the power. When you walk into that room next year, when all those people walk into that room, they're going to understand that at a certain point, they're going to have to bend the knee to these guys just a little bit. Now, you obviously don't want to cut out anyone. I very much want everyone to be involved, would love the group of five to be involved, but I'm kind of in favor of group of five playoff, and that's something I can get into in a little bit deeper detail later on. But at the end of the day, it's looking like we're looking at a 14-team playoff after the 2025 season, going into 2026, and really going forward. Could expand to 16, could expand to 25 at this point, 24 at this point, because that's just the reality of where we are right now. But the SEC and the Big Ten will have a lot to decide on how they want to go about this, and at least early reports of what they want is 4 auto bids. They want 4 auto bids each. They want the SEC to get 4 teams no matter what. They want the Big Ten to get 4 teams no matter what. And then down the ladder it goes. It goes for the Big 12 and the ACC. You get 2 each. So 2 Big 12 teams, 2 ACC teams. It's kind of interesting how that's going to work out with the conference titles, and we'll break that down here in a second. But then you're left with only 2 other spots. You're left with the Group of 5 champion, the highest rated, so was Boise State this year, could very well be UNLV or someone else another year, but at the end of the day, going to be an interesting thing to watch there. And then 1 at large, and let's just be totally honest, 9 times out of 10, that at large is going to be Notre Dame. That is a very, very good program right now. Marcus Freeman has them moving in the right direction, so I'd be a little bit surprised if it wasn't Notre Dame the majority of the years that this unfolded, and there's a lot of different things to kind of unpack here. Frankly, in my absolutely ideal world, it would be all auto bids. You would not have, or not all auto bids, all at-large bids, excuse me. It would not be any auto bids. People would be able to decide in that room. The problem is, if that was going to happen, I'd want a very different committee in that room than what we have right now. So that's probably not going to unfold. But with this, as you can see, there's not much of a committee to begin with. There's auto bids, and there's ways to figure out these auto bids without the committee being involved at all. And if we're going to have this same committee, then I'm not too opposed to that. I'll be totally honest with you. Now, wasn't opposed to anything the committee did this past year. Want to make that very clear. The right 12 teams got in. I did not think Alabama or Ole Miss or any of those teams should have been in over in Indiana or in SMU. But I also don't necessarily trust them to make the right decision in 2 years and in 3 years. So this isn't the worst idea in the world to me. Keeping it kind of out of their hands as much as possible and letting it be decided on the football field is not a bad idea to me. Now, it does lead to kind of some interesting things, and it definitely does lead to some interesting changes to how these conferences will operate going forward, especially when it comes to conference championship time. And that's kind of the big question. How do you get to 4 auto bids? Is it just the top 4 teams? Is it the 2 teams that go to the championship and just the next 2? How do you break that down? And one of the ideas that has come out is for the SEC, you got to get 4 teams, right? You have to find a way to get 4 teams. The top 2 teams will get bids. That's no question. Now, the question is, will they play on that championship Saturday? I think that's still very much up for debate. Will they have to play, or will it just be the number 1 team gets the better spot, the number 2 team gets the slightly worse spot, and they move forward from there? But those 2 teams will get bids regardless if they play that weekend or not. The new thing will be in both the SEC and the Big Ten, there would be a 3 versus 6 matchup and a 4 versus 5 matchup for those other 2 bids. So let's say 3 beats 6 and 4 beats 5. Those teams would get in. If 5 beat 4, they would get in over 4, and it would be kind of a rotating door of different teams that would have got in. So I believe one of the matchups this year would have been Alabama against LSU, or maybe Tennessee against Ole Miss. Those would have been very interesting matchups, and it would have been really fascinating to see how those would have kind of played out and how those teams would have ended up getting in or not getting in. And the reality of this is, when you have the SEC and the Big Ten, and if you did have it as all at large bids, it was no auto bids, and you were just picking the 12 or 14 or 16 best teams in the country, you'd find you get a lot of SEC and Big Ten teams. We did it this past season. You would get that pretty much every single season if it was auto bids. Or if it was at large bids, excuse me. But auto bids doesn't necessarily change that much to me. It doesn't necessarily hurt too much that the SEC and Big Ten are getting more auto bids than the Big 12 and ACC. I don't think any of them should get any auto bids, frankly, but I don't necessarily see it as a big issue because, let's just be totally honest, the SEC and the Big Ten are playing a little bit different level of football than what they're playing in the Big 12 and the ACC. This would likely be the case regardless of if there are auto bids or at-large bids, so I don't think it really changes the structure in terms of how many conferences get how many teams and that type of thing. Now, it does change conference championship weekend in a way that I don't necessarily love it. I'll be totally honest. I very much want these conference championships to mean something, and maybe they could. Maybe it could be you automatically get a home playoff game, or you automatically get home playoff games all the way up to the semifinal, or whatever that looks like. But I'd love to keep the energy in that SEC championship game, in that Big Ten championship game, and then in the Big 12 and the ACC, they're thinking about just not playing a championship game altogether. Because you remember back to last year, SMU was very worried. Going into that game, they did not think they were comfortably in, and if they were to lose that game by 14, 17 points, like it looked like they were going to there for a second, I don't think they would have gotten in. I think someone else would have jumped in above them, probably an Alabama team that has since been proven that they probably shouldn't have been in the first place. So I do think it's a very interesting conversation where SMU would have entirely avoided that conversation this year. If this was in place, they would have automatically been in, and then it would have been Clemson against Miami for that other ACC spot, and that would have been something to watch. There's no doubt about that, and probably something that I think it's up in the air, right? I think a lot of people would be in favor of this because these conferences are a logjam. The ACC has 17 teams. The Big 12 and the SEC have 16. The Big 10 has 18 teams. It's a lot of teams, and it's really hard for these teams to differentiate from each other. So those top 2 teams that go to Indianapolis or that go to Atlanta at the end of the year, are they all that different than the 3rd and 4th and 5th teams? And I think a lot of people would argue that Ole Miss team, not all that different than that Texas team that found their way to the semifinal this past year. So there's a lot of really back and forth arguments that could happen here. I fully understand that maybe that 3 and 6, or maybe that 6 team that is just a half game behind the number 2 team in the conference deserves a little bit more of a chance to possibly get involved, to possibly get into the field than they did this past year. But at the same time, I very much want these conference championships to mean something. I very much want them to be an important part of this game going forward. It feels like they're not going to be. So that's going to be something to watch, and definitely something that we will get into in time, and we'll see how this develops over this year because, as I said before, a lot of this is not going to happen until 2026. So we have a little bit of time to get used to it, a little bit of time to come to terms with it because there's going to be a lot of changing, especially to the kind of the schedule of the college football season, the way conference championship week works, the way a lot of this stuff works is going to change very quickly, but at least we have a little bit of time to get used to it. I think 2025 will look the exact same as this past year did, at least in terms of format. Maybe the seeding could be changed, but I'd be a little bit surprised there. After that, it's pretty much in the SEC and Big Ten's hands, and then you just got to pray that they make the right decision. I think there's a couple on the table that are okay. I don't necessarily think all of them are the way that I would go about it. So it's going to be a fascinating thing to watch. There's no doubt about that. And I think the future of the CFP, it's firmly in the hands of two people, Tony Petitti and Greg Sankey, and they can decide to do what they want to do with it. And frankly, it's probably not going to be something that a lot of people like, but it's going to be really interesting to watch this. Over the next 12 to 18 months, a lot's going to change, a lot of decisions are going to be made, and we're just going to have to see where all this lands. But you just got to hope that at some point the cooler heads prevail and we get everyone involved in a fair and equitable way, and we have a really fun playoff like we did this past year. A little too many teams in my opinion, but at the end of the day, I'm not opposed to more football. So we'll talk about that obviously in more detail throughout the offseason as more details come out around what the SEC and the Big Ten are thinking. But let's take our first break. Let's take a little break here, just a short one, and then let's get back to spring game cancellations. A lot of teams, including Texas, Nebraska, USC, deciding to not have a spring game this upcoming spring, and it's kind of making some people mad. So let's talk about it, why it's happening, why it's probably a good idea overall, and why there's definitely some downsides to it as well. But we'll talk about it right after this, so stick with us.